Yeah, I'll call State of Wisconsin versus Todd Kendhammer, 16 CF 909. Appearances.
State appears by Tim Grinke and Susan Donsky.
Good morning. Mr. Kendhammer appearing in person, and by counsel, Attorney Stephen Hurley and Jonas Bednarik. Also present at council table is Siobhan Cagle, paralegal.
Right. Last Friday, we were at the point where the state could rest, and you still intend to do that, Mr. Grinke?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. For purposes of the defense, I guess I'll accept you resting right now, but we'll still do that in front of the jury before they begin their case. So with that, do you have any motions you wish to bring?
I do, Judge. I move for a directed verdict in favor of Mr. Kendhammer. I have some argument that I'd like to make in support thereof. With the state resting at the point that we are at in this trial, their entire case has been a series of witnesses that in one form or another have testified that Barbara Kendhammer did not pass in accordance with what Todd Kendhammer's version of events are. None of their witnesses said or opined that this is what happened. They never gave us a theory of the case. Their theory of the case is it didn't happen as Mr. Kendhammer states. Absent cause and manner of death, they can't say how she died. So if we stopped right now and examine it from the jury's perspective as what could or could not be inferred, the answer must be no. I thought quite a lot about this over the weekend, and one of the problems that I see with where we're at is a unanimity concern. If we were to inquire of this jury to reach a determination of guilt or innocence, doing so in a unanimous fashion is impossible without a cohesive theory of prosecution, and there has not been one. So I don't know as though it's possible for a jury in this situation to unanimously agree to a version of events that led to Barbara Kendhammer's death. So in my mind, that raises unanimity concerns, but it also raises, in my opinion, confrontation concerns, because the state has not yet told us how they believe this happened. How is it that Mr. Kendhammer can confront what he doesn't know to be a theory? It's an odd case in the manner by which it's being prosecuted, because, like I say, they have not been able to tell us how they think it happened. They simply say it didn't happen as Mr. Kendhammer says it did. So with those issues swirling around, I believe it's ripe for a directed verdict and ask that the court enter one accordingly.
Mr. Grinke?
Your Honor, at this point, I think given all the inferences and viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the state's met its burden. We have the death of Barbara Kendhammer. We have an autopsy that indicated she died from blunt force trauma to the head, as well as numerous other injuries that are not consistent with accident or certainly suicide. And we have a defendant who was with her when she died and presented in his statement lies about where he was going that morning, factors such as her not calling in to work or being to work on time, which would be inconsistent with her normal habits, no sign of any flatbed truck anywhere that a pipe could have fallen off of, Randy Erler driving by and not seeing any damage to a windshield, indicating that that was a staged event as opposed to an accident. The grass and soil in the trunk and 4 impacts to the windshield more consistent with a cover-up than an accident. And the only conclusion you can draw is that the injuries were caused by Mr. Kendhammer, given that she had none the day before and that he caused her death. As far as unanimity, the law doesn't require the jury to be unanimous on every fact presented in front of them. They only have to be unanimous on the elements. They would certainly be unanimous on her death. They would be unanimous on the fact that it was intentional. There's been nothing to suggest anything else other than a cover-up. And they would be unanimous that the defendant was a person responsible.
Anything else, Mr. Bednarik?
No.
All right. Well, I agree that with the evidence presented thus far and the inferences drawn in favor of the state, and looking at the evidence in the light most favorable to the state, it's very clear if we stop now, the jury could, a reasonable jury could, enter a judgment of guilt on the elements for all the reasons Mr. Grinke indicated. I don't think they need to be unanimous at all in the manner of the death of Ms. Kendhammer, given the nature of the injuries as described by various witnesses, given the I guess lack of blood in the car for some of those injuries, especially the head wounds. I think they can conclude that there was a death, given the statements of Mr. Kendhammer that have been presented in a variety of ways throughout this trial. They can find that he was with her at the time of her death, and due to his statements and the manner of the damage to the car, that they could clearly find that he was the one responsible for her. So at this point, I will deny that motion. Anything else?
No.
No, Your Honor.
Anything else either side wants to put on the record before the jury comes in?
No.
Okay, just short. Go ahead.
We have a number of exhibits that need to be marked, so if we could get a few minutes to get these exhibits marked, it might make presentation of evidence more smooth.
We can do that. Are you handling that? Why don't you do that, but just tell me sort of your lineup for at least this morning.
We'll call Mark Meshulam. Our lineup for today consists of Mark Meshulam, a glass expert, Dr. Barry Bates, a biomechanic, and Todd Kendhammer.
Okay.
And those are the only three we plan on presenting today. I think it should take up most, if not all, of the day.
And then you have additional witnesses for Tuesday and Wednesday?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Just give them a heads up. That'll be just a few minutes. You may all be seated. Mr. Grinke, is my understanding from Friday and this morning that the state is resting?
Yes, Your Honor.
At this point, the state has concluded their presentation of their case, and at this point, Mr. Hurley, you're going to start on behalf of Mr. Kendhammer?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you may present your case and call your first witness.
I call Mark Meshulam. Your Honor, at this time, I would offer into evidence exhibits 222 through 258, which the parties have stipulated may be received into evidence.
Is that correct, Mr. Grinke?
Yes, Your Honor.
Exhibits 222 through 258 then will be received. Do you intend to publish them all?
I do, Your Honor.
Any objection, Mr. Grinke?
No.
All right. You may publish them as you see fit.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you state your name and spell it for the record, please?
My name is Mark Meshulam, M-A-R-K-M-E-S-H-U-L-A-M.
And, Mr. Meshulam, what do you do for a living?
Well, at this stage in my life, I am a full-time consultant and expert witness, specializing in glass and windows and building exteriors.
I've handed you a copy of Exhibit 258. What is that document?
This is my most recent CV, my resume.
And let me ask you a little bit about your background and what qualifies you to be an expert in glass. Can you tell the jury, please, about your education and training?
Yes, my education is a bachelor's and master's degree at University of Illinois. Both of them were in unrelated fields, social sciences. I have a master's in social work. I was even for a short time a licensed clinical social worker. But in the late 70s, I decided that really didn't fit very well. What I love is construction and buildings. And so I became a carpenter for a few years, eventually having my own carpentry company. And after about 3 years, I wanted to use my brain a little bit more, and I went and got some career counseling. and it was advised that I get a job as in sales of a construction product. And yes,
At Construction Consulting Lab West in Ontario, Canada?
yes,
Or is that Canada or California?
California,
Construction Research Laboratory in Miami, Florida?
yes,
Mid-America Testing Laboratory, Inc. in Catawissa, Missouri?
yes,
And Quast Consulting and Testing in Mosinee, Wisconsin?
yes. And there's one more now. Underwriters Laboratories has opened up a building envelope lab in Northbrook, which is where I live, and I've already got a project going there.
Along the way, did you obtain specialized education in glass?
Yes, I wish I received more because at the time I was coming up through the industry, there wasn't a lot of really well-developed building envelope curricula. But the various manufacturers that we were representing would have technical seminars. Our main manufacturer in the first 10 years of my career was in Wausau, Wisconsin, and that was a company called Wausau Metals. And they were pretty much at the top of the pinnacle in terms of providing education, a technical background, so I had a lot of interaction and a lot of education there. Also, PPG, a well-known name in coatings and glass, they at that time had a division where they furnished and installed whole wall systems that's called a curtain wall. And I attended a curtain wall engineering seminar with them. Also at Architectural Testing in York, Pennsylvania, they offered training on window testing, but I was already pretty well conversant with that.
Did you ever have an opportunity to attend courses in glass fractology?
Yes, this year I attended.
Before you go further,
I'm sorry.
can you tell the jury what glass fractology is?
Okay, it's fractography. Sorry, counselor. Fractography of any sort is the study of breakage. When materials break, how do they break, why do they break, and what does it look like when they break? Very often in fractography, you're actually looking at a macroscopic and a microscopic level. So that's what it is. As it pertains to glass, glass has a very well-developed field of glass fractography because glass breakage, as you can see from this matter, becomes very important. And yes, I did attend a one-week course this year in Alfred University, which is a New York State university. They have a curriculum in ceramics and glass, and the top fractography man in the country, George Quinn, taught that course. He wrote the book for the federal government, and he was my teacher for that course.
Have you previously served as an expert witness in cases involving glass?
Yes.
And are all of those prior occasions that you served as an expert witness in cases involving glass set forth in your curriculum vitae?
I'm sorry?
Are all of the cases in which you served as an expert witness in matters involving glass, are all of those set forth in your CV, your curricula vitae?
No, there are more. I was just reviewing the CV. I've got quite a few more that.
If you could approximately, on how many occasions have you served as an expert witness in cases involving glass?
Maybe about 30.
And in addition to serving as an expert witness in matters involving glass, do you consult with others about matters involving glass and glass breakage?
Yes.
And what are the types of persons or entities with whom you consult?
I consult with window and glass manufacturers. I consult with architects, engineers, general contractors, attorneys, building owners, property managers. That's about it.
And are you called in to consult after the fact of glass breakage in order to determine the cause and origin of the breakage?
Yes.
Do you also maintain a website?
Yes, I do.
And what is that website called?
ChicagoWindowExpert.com.
And what is the purpose of that website?
Well, it's a dual purpose. It serves as education for the readers. There are many people who have questions. They don't really have a place to get this particular type of information. It also serves as pretty much my primary marketing arm for people who need my kind of services to find me.
On the website, do you author articles for the public to read concerning matters involving glass?
Yes.
And does that include matters involving leaks, condensation, and failures of glass?
Yes.
Glass and window safety?
Yes.
Glass performance?
Yes.
Window testing?
Yes.
Window and building design?
Yes.
Over the course of your career, has it been of any import for you to learn about the manufacturing process for glass?
Yes.
Why is that of import?
Well, that's the beginning of it all. Sometimes flaws that appear later in the life of the glass occur actually when the glass is being made from sand. So I need to go all the way back to that point. Then there are other points in the manufacturing process that are, all of them are of interest.
And how was it that you educated yourself about the manufacturing process?
Well, I visited many glass manufacturing and fabrication facilities, and reading and studying up if I have a particular matter where there's a technical question at hand. I do quite a bit of research to determine what the industry is saying about it and to decide where to go next. Sometimes I develop my own testing methods.
In your CV at page 11, I see a listing of glass manufacturers that you have visited.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, there are a few more that I haven't added, both of which are in Japan. Excuse me.
Is it fair? Does it come to roughly 24 or more manufacturers that you have studied with over the years?
Yes.
Did there come a time when I asked you to review some materials in this matter?
Yes.
And so the jury understands, I'd like you to talk to them a little bit about what materials you were provided with for your review.
Sure. I've seen the police photos from the incident. I've seen the police photos from after the incident at various points when the vehicle was at various other locations.
Including the crime laboratory?
Yes. Well, actually, when I viewed the vehicle itself, I did view the vehicle itself, and it was in a storage facility here in La Crosse. But yes, including the crime laboratory photos.
Did you have the opportunity to review the criminal complaint in this matter?
Yes.
Did you have the opportunity to review reports of interview of Mr. Kendhammer,
Yes.
including audio and visual interviews of Mr. Kendhammer?
Right. I've seen the transcripts. I have not heard the audio.
Have you been provided with the crime laboratory report of bloodstain pattern analysis?
Yes.
Have you been provided with all of the reports of testing by the crime laboratory on the Kendhammer vehicle and the pipe?
Yes.
Have you reviewed the materials regarding the Google mapping of the Kendhammer automobile on the morning of September 16, 2016?
Yes.
Have you been provided with the reports of Trooper Marquardt and a fellow by the name of Muttart,
Yes.
M-U-T-T-A-R-T?
Yes.
Now, is it important for one in your position before examination of the glass to have as much information as possible regarding the circumstances of the occasion that purportedly led to the breakage of the glass?
Yes, it is.
Will you tell the jury why it's important to have as much information as possible?
When investigating something, it's easy to be led in the wrong direction if you don't have all of the information that's out there, whatever it may be. It doesn't mean that I would necessarily accept those at face value, but every little bit of information that comes through, no matter how small, is of value, because that might start another thought process that would help me look further in a particular direction. So yes, I really need to know everything, and that's really true in no matter what I investigate.
You mentioned that you had viewed the automobile in question here. Can you tell the jury just the circumstances of that viewing? When did it occur, and essentially what did you do when you viewed it? Just for the record, you're referencing something in front of you. What is it that you're referencing?
I issued a report on this matter, and please help me remember. And the main thing I'm looking up right now is the date, which was June 27th, 2017, that I viewed the vehicle in the storage facility of, I believe, the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office.
LaSalle or La Crosse?
La Crosse, sorry.
Tell the jury where your work is located physically, your office.
My office is in Northbrook, Illinois, which is a northwest suburb of Chicago.
And LaSalle County, is that a county just west of Cook County in Illinois?
Right, and that has nothing to do with this matter. La Crosse County is what I'm talking about.
Okay. On the date that you viewed the automobile, who was present while you viewed it?
The sheriff, I can get his name. And I believe a state's attorney. If you give me a moment, I can get their names.
Was it Ms. Donsky here?
Yes. I think so. I believe that's true. Let me make sure. I apologize for the delay. Police Captain John Zimmerman and District Attorney Susan Donsky.
Do you recognize Captain Zimmerman over here?
Yes.
As a result of your training and experience and your examination of the facts and data in this case, including your examination of the automobile, Were you able to reach any conclusions or opinions in this matter to a reasonable degree of professional certainty?
Yes.
And what were those conclusions?
Well, I assume we're talking about just specifically the glass right now?
Yes.
Okay. The glass fracture pattern indicates that there were 3 different events that caused the glass to break. The first one was a hand impact when Mr. Kendhammer's fist went into the glass. The second was the pipe puncture. And the third was a prying action that took place when the pipe was removed from the hole in the glass and brought around to the side of the car.
So what I'd like you to do is explain to the jury why it is you reached those opinions. Okay? And here I'm going to allow you to illustrate your testimony through the use of the exhibits that were just received into evidence. You have the device that will allow you to
Yes, sir.
change the pictures.
Oh, okay.
Madam Clerk, may I turn on the screen? This is Exhibit 222. Can you explain to the jury what's depicted?
222 was his curriculum vitae, wasn't it?
No, sir.
Is that 221?
The curriculum vitae was 258.
258, okay. Right, go ahead.
Thank you. This is the car as it appeared when the garage doors opened. It's covered in a powdery substance that is called luminol, and there are 2 tape measures or measuring tapes that are adhered to the glass.
And did you adhere those measuring tapes to the glass?
No.
You've now put up another picture, which is Exhibit 223.
Yes, this is just another view of the same thing. The vehicle, as I observed it before touching it or anything, you can see there's a lot of this substance on the car.
Was it necessary for you to remove the luminol in order for you to complete your examination?
Yes.
How did you go about doing that?
With Mr. Zimmerman's permission, I used a nylon brush to brush the luminol off.
Can you proceed to, this is Exhibit 224, which you're showing, and what is that?
This is a property tag that was in the windshield of the car.
Now you are displaying to the jury Exhibit 225. Can you explain to them what they're seeing, please?
Sure. This is a good picture to begin to talk about what I believe happened with the glass. So we have one area here, which is, for the record, I'll say it's to the right of the windshield as viewed from exterior. We have a second focal point of a fracture, which has a hole in it, the puncture. And then we have a smaller one to the above and to the left of it, which is relatively minor. So I'll call them 1, 2, and 3. In my opinion, these occurred in that order, 1, 2, and 3, and I'll explain why.
Your Honor, if I could just interrupt, he said 1, 2, or 3, but can identify which one is 1, 2,
Okay.
and 3.
So let me ask you some questions. What you identified as the first break appears to be a break in the glass that would have occurred somewhat behind the rear view mirror as viewed from the outside, to the center and right of the windshield. Is that correct?
Yes.
To the left of that, you had pointed to another fracture that appears to have a hole in it. Is that what you identified as the second break?
Yes.
And to the left of that second break, you pointed to another area on the glass Is that correct?
Yes,
And is that what you identified as having been the third break?
yes.
Now, let me stop you there for a minute before you go further and ask you a couple of questions about windshield glass. Of what is windshield glass composed?
Windshield glass is composed of laminated glass. Laminated glass is a type of safety glass. It's made up of, in this case, 2 layers of glass that are bonded to a sheet of pretty strong plastic between them that's called an interlayer. It's made of a material called PVB or polyvinyl butyrol. The glass on either side of that interlayer is pretty thin. It's only about 1/8 of an inch thick, and the PVB is about a 1/32. So the overall makeup, the thickness of that glass is just right around 1/4 of an inch. The way you make this glass is you have to form it into the shape of a windshield on a metal form, where the glass that's cut to size is heated up so that it becomes plastic, and then it lays down and it drapes around the formwork. When that cools, they can remove that, take the 2 pieces that are identical, put a sheet of PVB between them, and then those are placed in an autoclave, which is a vacuum chamber, where heat is also applied. And when it comes out of the vacuum chamber, it's transparent. The PVB, when it goes in, is pretty milky, but when it's all fused together, it's very transparent. And the purpose of the PVB and the purpose of laminated glass in this case is to hold the glass together in the event of breakage. You can imagine how dangerous it would be if your windshield were to break and completely open you up to the weather and the wind while you're driving. That could get you into a much more serious problem than you already had. So it's mandated by law that laminated safety glass be used in windshields. Now, that's a little bit different than other types of safety glass that are also in vehicles. You may be familiar with tempered glass. Tempered is also a safety glass, but it derives its safety from a different method. The tempered glass, when it breaks into a lot of very small pieces. And those are determined to be more safe in the event of human contact. So if you come in contact with those small cubes, you'll be cut less than if you were in contact with very large glass shards. So they're both safety glass, laminated and tempered. And by the way, tempered is on the side windows, the rear window, and if there was a sunroof, it would also be in the sunroof. So that's laminated glass.
When we look at Exhibit 225 and we see various lines and concentric circles, why is that?
Okay, now we get into fractography, and that's a pretty big subject, but I'll go step by step, and it won't be so overwhelming or scary once we break this down. The first thing to understand about this picture is, since you're looking at 2 pieces of glass that are bonded together, each one of them is breaking, which means that you might see actually 2 lines in a similar place, and one of them would be the outer piece of glass and one would be the inner piece of glass. So that makes it a little bit confusing. But
May
putting...
I interrupt you to ask a question?
Sure.
If you are identifying 3 impacts to the windshield, does that mean that there are 6 crack patterns?
Yes, there will be 3 per layer, times 2 is 6.
And I called it a crack pattern. What is the proper terminology?
Well, they do say crack pattern, they say fracture pattern.
If there had been 4 impacts, would there have been 8 crack or fracture patterns?
Yes, if they penetrated both pieces of glass, then you would have 4 times 2 is 8.
And were there 8 crack or fracture patterns on the Kendhammer vehicle's windshield?
No.
How many were there?
Well, if you just look at the big picture, it's 3, but each layer was broken, so that would make it 6.
Go ahead and continue.
Well, laminated glass has some properties that are useful and also interesting. The useful part is that it stays together pretty much in the event of breakage. And that's true of this entire windshield with the exception of the puncture right here. All the rest of it is staying together, and that's a great thing for people like me because it leaves all the evidence right there to be examined at length. And I spent about 4 hours studying this extremely carefully under magnification, looking really closely at how all of these cracks are converging, and also from the inside. And I can tell you a number of things. Shall I just proceed?
Just before you do, let me ask a question about what you just talked about. You said that you looked at this for 4 hours from inside and out. In the course of examining the glass, besides magnification, did you have occasion to take measurements?
Yes.
And what was it that you were measuring?
Well, I took measurements of the overall piece of glass. I laid out the position of the fracture origins. That's the term we use for where the cracks start. I looked at the diameter of the puncture. I looked at also the depth of this number 3. That was interesting. I used a depth micrometer for that.
What is the depth micrometer?
Well, here's a depth micrometer. The little point, however far it sticks out away from the surface, is read out on this digital readout. So I sharpened this one so I could use it for glass because very often the glass cracks are pretty small. And so I used this to put the point into the glass in a particular area of interest to determine how much glass was actually displaced during a particular event. I used this on location number 3.
Okay, I had interrupted you to ask about that. If you want to continue.
Okay. With regard to laminated glass, once it's broken, it becomes somewhat flexible. So it starts out like an eggshell, pretty hard, and it's also curved like an eggshell, interestingly enough, and it has a membrane like an eggshell too. So there's a lot of similarities there, and it's brittle. But when you sort of start to fracture it, the different portions of it become flexible with regard to one another. That's going to become important in a little bit.
When you say the portions of it become flexible, are you talking simply about the PVB between the glass, or does the glass itself become flexible?
The glass itself becomes flexible, and the PVB is allowing it to be flexible instead of falling out completely. So the PVB is holding these pieces together, but you can get those various sections to move in relation to one another. In fact, we worry when we're designing skylights for buildings, we worry about putting laminated glass on a skylight because if it breaks, there's a potential that it might sag so much that it would fall out of its moorings, and that's called the wet blanket effect. So we know, it's very well known in the industry, that laminated glass becomes flexible when it's broken. But if you know about that and you design for it, it's okay. But it has relevance to some of these cracks that you're seeing.
Okay, and what is the relevance of that to the cracks?
Well, the main relevance is that when you see certain cracks that look rather thick, like this one, like that one, like this one, they're cracks that occurred in 2 stages. The first stage was that the crack propagated through the glass, and that is an extremely fast process. It's been estimated and clocked out that annealed glass, and by the way, this is annealed glass, it's not hardened or heat treated or tempered, it's just the glass that comes out of the plant that makes it out of sand, and it's been annealed, which means that it's been relaxed so there are not a lot of internal tensions in it. That's what this kind of glass is before it's laminated together, and it still is still annealed glass. So when annealed glass breaks and those cracks propagate through it, depending on how much force is applied to the glass, that will tell you pretty much how fast the cracks will propagate. There are estimates in the industry that in annealed glass, the cracks can easily propagate at 700 miles an hour. And there's a study that I cited in my report where the glass fracture of laminated windshield glass was measured with a device that could measure to the millionth of a second, and it's calced out at something a little slower than that, not too much. So the easiest way to think about it is, what it all boils down to is, any of these cracks that you see here, if they were subject to a sizable force, which number 1 and number 2 definitely were, those cracks are propagating at the rate of about 1 foot per 1,000th of a second, up to 4 thousandths of a second. So all of this is happening very, very quickly. If you were to look at it while it was happening, it would pretty much be faster than your eye could blink. Okay, so
If you don't mind, can we go to the next picture, please?
sure. Do we have to aim it this way? Did it stop? It's not working, yeah.
Let's see if we can affect this by hand.
Okay.
Here we're looking at Exhibit 226. Can you explain to the jury what this close-up shot illustrates for them?
Sure. So now we're looking a little bit more closely, and what we see is a combination of two main types of glass cracks. One type is called radial. Radial is like the spokes of a wheel. So radial cracks are the ones that come off the origin, and they pretty much shoot off like the main strands of a spider web, but probably a better metaphor would be the spokes of a wheel. And we see that here, we see it here, and to an extent we also see it coming off of number 3. And that's where it gets tricky, because these cracks are overlapping and intersecting one another. But the intersecting, if you dissect them, you can begin to see what goes first and what goes second. The second thing that you see aside from the radial cracks are the circular cracks. So here we have a circular crack, and here we have another one, and here we have another one. So when the radial cracks are propagating, usually when they get roughly to the point of where the circular crack is, that's when the circular cracks start to form. Now, since I mentioned that 1 foot of crack propagation could happen in between 1 and 4 thousandths of a second, this is all going really, really quick. But basically, the reason these circular cracks form is that the area within it has become flexible. And to a certain extent, possibly momentarily, or maybe not, it's bulging out a little bit, and it's forming a crease in those areas, which then break. The glass fractographers will say that energy is released by the glass's ability to create new surface. So that's the way they say it. But what it really means is that when you have energy within a glass, no matter how it got there, whether from impact or thermal loads or some other thing, it releases itself. If it gets to a breaking point, it releases itself through creating cracks. And those cracks actually tell you about the energy and where the energy is going. So this one, then to get into a finer point, This number one. This is when Mr. Kendhammer punched the glass in an attempt to instinctively deflect something that he perceived coming to the windshield. And the origin of that crack is right here. It's at a place where, on this line, that's where the glass actually folded inward. Because this ridge, this here is a ridge, and so that's where his knuckles went, and that's what pushed the glass out really far. And then his knuckles also intersected the bottom of the crease. So here's the origin, and that crease continues on that line, and that lined up with his knuckles. So the glass was the glass was bulging out. So here's the bulge, and the fracture origin was down here. So he was punching into it. Fracture origin was here because the glass folded out, and the fracture continued along that line, and it opened up the glass, meaning that it stretched open, and now it became jagged along that line, and that's what got him on the knuckles. I put myself in the car seat, tried to emulate his body position as he related, and it all fit quite well. Right hand on the steering wheel, left hand up into the windshield. He and I are pretty similar body size. And I came away with glass particles on my hand. I've got pictures of that. The other thing about this, and this is getting you into a pretty fine point of fractography, is if you notice this curvature here, it's not exactly concentric with this one. Very often, if you have just a normal impact to a piece of glass, the circular rings are pretty much centered right on that center. That's normal. But if there's something unusual happening, you actually get the concentric rings enlarging in one direction or another. And the reason for that is because the force that he was exerting on the glass was not only outward, but it was also actually in this direction. So you got that last curvature being so much farther away from the inner circle because the force was not only going out toward the sky, but also down and to the left. So this is number one, and that's the story behind it. And in pretty much all of these cases, all of these cracks that you're seeing are actually mirroring between the outer piece of glass and the inner piece of glass. Most of the time they look like one, but if the picture were a better resolution, you would actually see there two.
Go to the next picture, please. What do we see here?
Okay, this is at number 2. This is the puncture at fracture number 2. This is where the pipe penetrated the windshield.
This is exhibit what?
This is exhibit 227, Your Honor. Please.
Okay. Well, a couple of things you need to know about this. Number 3 origin is here, and in the real world, it's actually up here. So you need to kind of adjust it in your brain. The picture gets rotated a little bit to match the true condition. But the thing that you would know about the puncture is, one thing is that it was a circular object that went through it. You're puncturing glass, in this case, very similar to the way you would puncture your notebook paper with a punch. It's just really the same thing because that punch comes through and it's shearing. It's basically shearing through the material. But the thing to know about this is that almost all the time when you have glass punctures, you will have a flap left behind. And the reason for that is that it's very rare or very difficult to have the puncturing object hit the glass at all surfaces at the exact same time. There will always be some angle where, like if we're talking about a pipe, which we are, there will always be some angle where the pipe is getting to the windshield, where some part of the pipe is hitting the glass before the other. And that's going to be the part that shears away. So it's very likely that right here, which would be down, remember you got to rotate this picture a little bit, right here is where the very first contact between the pipe and the glass took place.
And just for the record, when you say right here, what you see on the screen is this puncture and a flap. If we look at the flap, there is an open space between the flap and the rest of the windshield. Am I describing that properly?
Yes, there's an open space. It's like a crescent, like a quarter moon, where with its fingers pointing upward. And if you rotate it a little bit, I think you'd have to rotate it about maybe 30 or 40 degrees clockwise to get it in the correct orientation. You'll see that this part where the pipe went through first and first created that sheared hole is pretty much down near the bottom of the hole.
At that crescent, you see the part with the reddish hue in kind of a crescent moon shape?
Is that
Yes.
here?
Well, and above it as well.
Here? I apologize, I'm a little colorblind.
What you're pointing to there, is that the PVB without glass shards on it?
Yes. Yeah, so the area I'm going to describe with the pointer right now, which is also pretty much a quarter moon shape, this is all PVB where the glass particles have become delaminated from it. So now it's just a piece of plastic.
In your inspection of the windshield, were you able to see how much glass had been delaminated and was no longer on the PVB?
Yes.
And what can you tell us about the quantity of glass that was released from the PVB?
Okay, that's a really important point. Well, as I mentioned, laminated glass is designed to hold the glass particles together, so the glass is adhering to the PVB. But sooner or later, you're going to get to a point where some of the glass comes off if it has too much force applied to it. So in this case, we had a big pipe coming through and then coming back out again, and that was capable of dislodging some particles. But in contrast to other types of impacts, this type of puncture would dislodge far less because it's over a very narrow area, and it's really catching that windshield by surprise, so the whole thing isn't really flexing that much to begin with. What does happen, though, with laminated glass is that the large particles might not be released, but what is released is little slivers. Powder, glass powder, that gets sort of powdered up, and you get sharp little splinters, and you also get little, we call them oysters, they're tiny little crescent-shaped flakes that come off of the glass edge. And those are, we know about those are still deemed to be an acceptable trade-off when you're designing glass to keep the weather out and the wind out when you're driving. So, but you do get that.
Are those microparticles capable of causing injury?
Sure.
And what would an injury from those microparticles look like?
Well, you can get them in your lungs, but you won't see anything from that. You can get them in your eyes, and you won't see anything when that happens. But most likely, if you get it on your hands, and then you wipe your face or anything like that, you can actually scratch yourself. And you can also puncture your hands because those slivers are really, really sharp.
When we talk about those slivers or oysters or microparticles, how small are they?
Well, the microparticles would be like dust. So you could see them if you had a lot of light shining and you'd see dust flying in the air. The slivers may be up to 1/4 of an inch long and very narrow, like less than 1/16 of an inch, pointed at both ends. And then if the particle is released, like here where the particle actually came off, those would be the size like this, like you see these little pieces. And those, you could call them cubes. And they do come off sometimes like in little cubic shapes.
This is Exhibit 228, which we're displaying. Can you explain to the jury what this is?
Sure. This is a view from the inside of the car looking out. It just gives you a different perspective. And it kind of shows you where the area of where some of the particles were dislodged. And also this is number one, and this is number 2 puncture, and this is number 3, which we haven't talked about yet. But
So from the inside of the automobile, when you just identified number 2 puncture, that is in the center, and we can see through the glass where there is no glass whatsoever. Am I describing that correctly?
yes,
And to the right and upward from that, you identify what you call the number 3 impact?
yes,
Is that correct? Are you now pointing to the point of origin of the fracture from the 3rd impact?
yes.
Can you generally describe the area of fracture from the 3rd impact?
Sure. Well, up and away from the number 2 is this origin that has a number of radial cracks coming from it in different directions. But the interesting thing about this origin is that at its center, it has a butterfly pattern. Butterfly pattern is a pair of polygons, usually of hexagon, usually like it'd be a 6-sided figure, and they border one another. And whenever, in glass breakage, whenever you see a butterfly pattern, you know that the origin happened right on that border between the 2 butterfly wings. So I went right over there and took a look at it very, very carefully, and was surprised to see almost nothing. So I put my depth micrometer into, there was a little tiny crevice in there. I put my depth micrometer in there, and the depth I could get it into was less than 2 millimeters, and it was just a very tiny, it was like one little piece of glass was dislodged. It was, in terms of what you might consider impact, pretty underwhelming and probably not likely. So I came to the conclusion that that really wasn't quite impact, that was really more pressure. I don't know if we have a good slide for that. Okay, you can go back one. That one. Okay.
Here, so I can identify it for the record before you talk, we are looking at Exhibit 235.
Okay. Again, the one adjustment you need when looking at this photo is you do need to rotate it a little bit to the right clockwise. The reason I did it this way was I wanted to get everything in the picture a certain way. And I forgot that I might be explaining this one day, so please forgive me for that orientation. So here we have the number 3 focal point, and in this picture you can barely make out.
For the record, so I can describe it, on Exhibit 228, in a yellow screen at the top, it says focal point of secondary crack, no puncture, only 1.2 millimeter chip depth.
You said this was 235.
You're correct. I misspoke. I apologize, Aaron. Thank you for the correction. It's Exhibit 235. And there you have an arrow pointing downward, where you just had your red pointer. Was it on the blue line directly below where the arrow points down?
Yes.
Okay. I apologize for the interruption.
Okay, so what we see here, this is actually the butterfly pattern. It's obscured by the line, unfortunately, but you can kind of see behind it that here's one hexagon, or polygon, let's just call it. It's a multi-sided figure, could be 5 sides, 6 sides, and it borders another one. And so we're going to zoom in on this shortly. But what I found interesting was that that line very nicely came across the puncture flap. That's the flap when it was pulled up to actually fill the hole. It's not drooping in right now. It's actually filling the hole. And then the crescent around the area, which is actually missing most of its glass particles, is this area here. And it had a bulge. It had an upward bulge to it. So by observing this, the
What
bulge...
did the upper bulge indicate to you?
What that indicates to me is that when Mr. Kendhammer withdrew the pipe from the hole, and by his account, he was standing between the passenger door and the car. And he was reaching over, and remember, he was also reaching uphill because the back of it was down into a ditch. And he was reaching over to try to withdraw that pipe. And he brought it out most of the way and started to swing it around toward him so he could get rid of it. But the last little bit, with the end of the pipe, he actually caught the remaining part of the glass and bulged it outward and caused the glass particles that were on it to pop off. And all this happened very, very quickly, but that's what I see happened. And I have other layouts showing you how that fits into the larger picture.
Clerk, can I switch over to the envelope for a moment? Here I'm going to show you a photograph that was previously marked as Exhibit 216. Have you had occasion to see this photograph previously?
Yes.
And what does it depict?
Well, this is a police photo from the scene, and we're looking at the outside of the windshield from the passenger side near the fender. I believe is where the camera was placed. In the distance, you see the bulge from Mr. Kendhammer's hand impact. And closer to you, you can see this is the flap area and the bulge that accompanies it. And then over here, yeah, you could zoom in, that would be great.
Is that sufficient?
Yeah, and then over here is number 3 origin.
Now, in this particular picture, were you able to observe shards of glass on the outside of the windshield?
Yes, you can see quite a few. And these would be the types of, we could call them cubes or particles that would be created when the pipe was withdrawn from the hole and it dislodged that grouping of particles that were on the bulged area. So when you see the one area that has no particles on it, these are the particles. All these. So they ended up on the outside of the windshield because they were being pulled out.
When you observed the automobile at the Sheriff's Department garage, were those shards of glass on the outside of the windshield any longer there?
No.
May we switch back to the computer now? I'm going to get you to go back 2 photos. Here I'm showing you Exhibit 233. Can you describe for the jury what we're seeing?
Yes. Again, this picture needs to be rotated a little bit in the clockwise direction. But we see the flap, we see the opening. The dark area is just basically you're looking right through the glass. And then the upward bulge with particles missing. This is the section right here where I believe the pipe was withdrawn and then pried up at that last moment, causing all the particles to become dislodged from this area.
Here we're looking at Exhibit 234. And what does this depict?
It's pretty much the same thing. In this case, you would need to rotate the picture a little bit more because the origin is really up here of number 3. But we see also that there's a dark discoloration just at the bottom edge of that area of the crescent where the particles are missing.
Here I'm showing you Exhibit 236. What does this depict?
This just shows you the dimensions of the various parts of this this crack arrangement, where you can see actually in inches how far away I will call number 3 the prying origin is from the flap and from the crescent where the bulge went up. You can also see here the 2 layers of cracking that occurs in laminated glass. All of these are actually pairs. That's why it's so active. When you look at it, you see so many cracks. It's because both pieces are getting cracked similarly.
So let me ask you a question about that. When an impact such as one that occurred here happens, those fracture lines, how, in layman's terms, how thin, how thick are they?
Well, they initially start out almost infinitely thin because the crack occurs, but the pieces of glass on either side of that crack are still pressed pretty tightly to each other. So the crack, in a way, you would say is zero thickness at the beginning. Now, later on, when more activity takes place on the glass, the cracks get more rustled up and the edges of the glass start to chip away, and that's when you get these larger crack presentations. Like something like this, you see a lot of activity along that line, along this line, along this line. These are radial cracks I'm pointing out, but they've seen more activity. They didn't just get one single crack and it was over. Something else happened then that caused the cracks to abrade one another.
If there is an initial impact to glass causing a crack or fracture pattern, and a subsequent or second impact, can the second impact affect the pattern of the crack pattern from the first impact?
Yes, that
Can
can
you
easily
explain to the
happen.
jury how that happens?
Well, remember that the crack is occurring because it's releasing energy. And if you have a pre-existing crack nearby where there's a new need to release energy, like a new impact, well, very often the cracks that are propagating off of the second impact will find their closest way to release the energy is to connect up with the cracks that are already there. If you don't have that, the cracks try to go to the glass edge, because then when you physically separate each quadrant of glass, then the energy is fully released. But in this complex scenario here, very often you can get cracks that just find the other pre-existing crack, and then my job becomes harder because I have to decipher, what happened.
Showing you now Exhibit 237. What does this depict?
This is a view of the same area that we've been discussing, but from the inside, where you can see the flap, you can see the open area, the bulged area, the line that they all lay on, and the in this case, I'm calling it number 3, but the picture labels it as the secondary crack origin.
I'm showing you Exhibit 238. What does this depict?
Okay, this is number 3, and I mentioned the butterfly pattern. This is the butterfly pattern right here, and the origin of this crack will be right on that intersection between the two polygon shapes, or the two butterfly wings.
Is there something about this butterfly pattern that was of import to you in determining that crack was the representative of a third impact rather than a second impact?
Yes, but I think we'll need a different picture for that. But for the moment, what I'd like to point out is this. This actually is what I'd like to point out, is that...
Here we're looking at Exhibit 239.
There you go.
Got the right one.
Okay. So here are the two polygons. And I noticed there was a little gap between them. That was the area where I was able to get my depth measurement with the micrometer, and I only got 1.2 millimeters of depth in this gap right here. But then I also looked a little bit more closely, and I noticed on this edge there was a chip, and on this edge there was a chip. Well, being that they're on the boundary between the two polygons, that becomes very significant. And I have another picture of that chip from a different angle. It should be before or after this one. There it is.
This
So-
is Exhibit 240.
Yeah. That's the chip right there, and there's another one on the other side. This one's easier to see. The one on the left side of the crack. Here's the crack where the piece was missing, and here's the corresponding part of the chip here.
And what does that tell you?
Well, that's definitely, without a doubt, the origin of that series of cracks. But the thing about it is that I'm of the understanding that the prosecution is believing that
Yes,
this...
Your Honor.
So
Stating
I
prosecution's
started looking at the relationship between this and the flap and the bulge, and it turns out they line up perfectly. So that's when I started to develop the theory that this is the point at which the side of the pipe was being pried against the windshield for a brief moment during the extraction of the pipe from the hole.
Here I'm showing you Exhibit 241.
Okay, so
What does this depict?
in this picture, I used a piece of tape to represent the pipe. It's the length of the pipe, and it follows the 3 points that I mentioned, the bulged part, the presumed center of the flap, and the origin number 3, and I extended that out in a straight line to the best of my ability, and it fit perfectly the positioning that I would expect to see if Mr. Kendhammer were standing here, as he described, between the car and the open door, reaching over the windshield, trying to pull the pipe out, bringing it up and over, and placing a momentary sort of a fulcrum load, prying off of this part of the windshield. Remember, the windshield's curved. So when he brings the pipe down, it's going to only contact one spot on the glass for that brief moment. And I believe that's number 3. This one here, the blue, that's number 1.
Is this this is Exhibit 242. Is this a close-up of Exhibit 241?
Yes.
Maybe go to the next one. Here's Exhibit 243. Is this photograph which you put your notes on?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what it represents?
This one is number 1. The bulge above the general glass curvature, I've drawn it for you because you really can't see it. But this is a ridge in the glass. where Mr. Kendhammer's knuckles, this part of the knuckle, contacted the glass. And this line here is the fold where the glass folded upward, creating that crack origin, and also creating that open line of jagged glass that cut his knuckles down in this area.
Maybe we go to the next one. Showing Exhibit 244. What does that depict?
This is me, to the best of my ability, reenacting what Mr. Kendhammer stated happened. He said he thought he had his right hand on the steering wheel, and he went up with his left hand and was attempting to deflect a presumed threat, which he thought for a second was a bird, and putting his hand into the glass. And the geometry works out pretty well.
Can I go to the next picture, please? Here I'm showing Exhibit 245. What does this depict?
This is looking up and out at that same area, and you can see this would be the crack origin for that grouping.
And there you were pointing to the second knuckle of the left hand index finger, is that correct?
Yes, yes. But what's happening here that you may have a hard time seeing is this knuckle is way up high into the glass. So this surface right here is actually sloped, creating a fold in the glass that runs along this line.
And go back one, please. Here I'm showing you Exhibit 246. What is this?
So when I put my hand up into that area, these knuckles came away with more glass particles that became released. I didn't jam my fingers enough in to get the other set, but that is what we're seeing.
Next picture, please. Showing you Exhibit 247. What is this?
This is a police photo from the incident of Mr. Kendhammer's left hand.
Go to the next. Here I'm showing you Exhibit 248. Can you tell the jury what this represents, please?
This is a study that was done by a group, I believe, out of Japan, where they used extremely high-speed cameras to study glass breakage in car windshield. And it was fascinating to me because it's pretty hard to get this kind of study. That kind of camera would be really pricey, something that could go to the millionth of a second. But what it's basically telling us is that when you have a crack when you have an impact on one side of laminated glass, the crack actually starts on the opposite side. That's the main thing that this is telling you. So
And why is that?
Well, what's happening is if you have an impact on one side of the glass, then the outer surface of glass is being the most stretched. And it's being put in what we call tension, which means pulling it apart. So it's the first thing to really open up and to start to form those cracks.
And how long after let's say if the impact came from the inside, how long after the outer pane of glass broke is it before the inner pane of glass breaks?
Only about 760 millionths of a second. So you could think of it as a thousandth of a second. And those are the types of time intervals that we really have to think about when we talk about glass, because everything happens so quickly. So the outer layer, in this case, when Mr. Kendhammer's hand hit the glass, the outer layer broke first to the tune of, let's say, a thousandth of an inch faster, and then the inner layer started to go through that same process. And then the other thing you need to know is that when the cracks propagated out, when they got out to a certain extent, then the circular patterns would form roughly at the same time that the the radial patterns were to reach it.
I'm showing you Exhibit 249. What does this depict?
Well, this is fracture number 1, where Mr. Kendhammer's hand punched in from beneath this. This is the exterior face of the glass, and the line along which his these knuckles would contact would be along this line, and that fold that became the fracture origin is down here. And these radial cracks you can see are rising up and over the ridge, and they pretty much shoot off in all directions.
Your Honor, if you wanted to take a break, this would be a good moment to pause.
That'd be fine, thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll have you step out, don't talk about the case, and enjoy your break about between 10 and 15 minutes, give or take.
Please rise.
You all be seated. All right, the record can show we're back in the courtroom outside the presence of the jury. As I instructed jurors when I talked with them before, one came forward, they're being hassled at work through a variety of ways. So I think we need to bring the juror in and see what effect it's having on them. I don't know why they're at work, but I think we'll need to do that. The counsel have any comments before I do that?
Are we going to do this individually, Your Honor?
There's only one.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, you said one juror said they were getting
Harassed at work.
Okay.
Probably don't have your juror information. Here's the questionnaire. Yep. Everybody may be seated. Okay, I'm going to refer to you only as your juror number, okay? That's 4168, I believe. I think you did what you were supposed to do and came forward and related to Hallie that there was some interaction going on at work. Is that correct?
I just walked away from it. I mean, they just asked me. I told them I couldn't say anything, and I walked away.
Okay, is this one time or multiple times?
It was just one time yesterday.
Okay. That's partly concerning, did your employer not let you get off on the subpoena?
My employer made me work yesterday and Saturday because that was my days to work, and they just said I had to be there or I'd be in trouble.
Okay, is that causing you any problem being able to sit as a juror?
No.
Are you off the rest of the week?
Yes.
Okay.
I was off all last week and then this week, and then I just had to work Saturday and Sunday.
All right. Did the comments anyone made to you cause you to be influenced in any way in your mind?
No.
Right.
I didn't hear any comments. They just asked me if I could talk about it, and I said no.
That's fine. You did the right thing. Mr. Grinke, any questions?
I just want to make sure we understand, was it harassing, or did you feel pressured, or was it just a question?
No, they just asked me, well, how's it going on jury duty? And I just said, can't talk about it. And
I see, okay,
I walked out of the office.
thank you.
Anything from you?
No, it's the right answer. Thank you.
You did handle it correctly. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't something more, especially with the employer having you go to work. I've had other jurors that have became quite ill because they had to do the double shift, basically. So thank you for your comments. Thank you for your time. And I guess you can just, do you have stuff you need to get? Your notes? Yeah, take her back and she can come in with the group then. Thank you. Don't bring the group in quite yet, though, Mr. Corbusier. Mr. Corbusier? So, we've excused the juror back to the jury room. Anything else the state wants to put on record before we continue?
No, I don't see an issue. It sounded like an innocent question, not any harassment or influence.
Nothing other than pointing out that her place of employment is referenced in her juror questionnaire. I don't think we need to make that part of the record. Her juror questionnaire is.
That's correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Nothing else then? We can bring the jury in, continue with the direct exam by Mr. Hurley. Okay. You may all be seated. Let me come back up on the stand.
Mr. Meshulam, I've placed on the easel exhibit number 5. Your Honor, because of what occurred the other day, can we inquire whether the glare off this is preventing anyone from the jury?
Yep, we sure can. Is everyone able to see the photograph all right? Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Meshulam, I have a question about this. Do you see well, let me come up and I'm going to point to a line.
Okay.
Did you see the line to which I referred?
Yes.
What can you tell us about that crack?
Well, this is a line that runs across the flap. It goes off in two directions. To the right, where it appears to intersect with the circular crack around number 1, and to the left, where it appears to intersect with the origin of what I have called number 3.
Does the positioning of that line show that what you call number 2 is actually number 3, and what you call number 3 is actually number 2?
No.
Can you explain to the jury why that is?
Yes. It may appear that because this line is very thick and noticeable, and that it runs through the flap, and it comes fairly close to origin number 3, that it is actually originating from origin number 3. But in my opinion, it is not. In my opinion, it's emanating from origin number 1. That's going to be very, very hard to see, but if you can see where my pointer is, there is a small, thin crack that comes from way out over here into origin number 1, and it arrives at this circular crack, which is sort of the outer boundary, but not exactly a hard boundary of origin number 1. And then that crack, when it enters the next area, it becomes much more lively and thick and very, very noticeable. So this is an example of what I was mentioning earlier, where, well, actually, there's one thing I didn't mention, and that is if you have a crack that crosses another crack, it's not out of the question that the first crack can actually cross across the second crack. That can happen. Especially if you consider that the radial cracks on number 1 and the circular cracks on number 1 occur, they meet the same point about at the same time. So it's my belief that this crack and a series of others, I can point out a number of them, cross the boundary of this thick, agitated line, which is the outer circular line of number 1, and they actually come into the second area that has a lot going on. Now,
Mr. Meshulam, before you go further, you said in using your pointer that it is difficult to see on this exhibit the continuation of that line to the right-hand side of the exhibit past the radial crack that came from number 1. Do you recall saying that?
yes.
Do you think it might be easier for the jury to see that if I walked up there and held it closer, and then you put your red pointer on that?
Yes, but I would like to, before we do that, I want to make one other point.
Certainly.
And in order to do that, I need to approach the photo. Would that be okay?
You can't talk from over there, though.
I understand. I just want to point, and I'll come back. Okay.
Go ahead.
All right.
With Your Honor's permission, may I take the easel and position it closer to the jury?
That help?
I'll say one sentence, and then I think it'll be more easier to understand,
Sure.
if with your permission.
Certainly.
I first just used my pointer to show that crack that comes in from area number 1, and it comes into the area crossing number 2, and even looks like it comes close to number 3. And so I drew it a few times across, and that is present. And then I drew another little line which created a triangle right on the flap itself. You'll be able to see this closer up. What's happening here is what tells me that the crack came from the right and not from the left. And that is that crack is branching. So one of the terms I didn't introduce yet is crack branching. It's a big deal in the glass fractography area, because when glass is using cracks to dissipate energy, it does so sort of like a tree. You might start out with one crack, and then it branches off into 2 to release more energy. And if there's still more energy in the system, it branches off again. So by observing the crack branching, you can kind of reverse engineer what direction the crack is coming from. And in my opinion, the crack is coming from right to left.
May I, Your Honor?
Me?
Mr. Meshulam, while they're observing this, I'm going to ask you to go back with your laser pointer and show them once again what you did prior to it being moved up there, and in particular that area of forking or branching.
I will, and would it be useful if I were to put a sticky note on either side of that triangle that's formed, or near it,
That would be
to
fine.
make it more visible?
That would be fine. Madam Clerk, may I go back to the screen, please? I'm showing you here Exhibit 229. Do you recognize that as a photograph from the scene with which you were provided?
I do.
And were you able from this to make any determinations about the amount of glass that was expelled from the windshield inward after the occurrence?
Well, only that it looks about right for the type of fracture that took place.
And is there a large volume of glass?
No, I really wouldn't expect a large volume of glass, especially not in the large particle family. More dust, little slivers, and really not very much of it.
May I switch to the elbow, please? I'm going to show you what was previously marked as Exhibit 114. recognize the front seat of the Kendhammer vehicle?
Yes.
And this was a photograph taken at the crime laboratory, as we can see from the print below the photograph.
Yes, I see that.
Do you find that by the time it got to the crime laboratory, the amount of glass on the seat was changed in any significant manner?
I don't think so.
In addition to examining the automobile and the glass fractures on it, did I ask you to do something else?
Yes, I had another question to answer.
And what was the question I asked you to answer?
How easy or hard would it be for a passerby to notice the breakage on the windshield at the time immediately after or during the event?
Maybe switch. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 211. Did you have an opportunity to view that photograph?
Yes.
And how, if at all, did viewing that photograph play a role in your answering that question I asked you?
Well, that question sounds simple, but it actually isn't simple at all, because in order to determine how easy or hard it would be to see this glass breakage on the windshield, I would need to determine the angle of the windshield, what way it was facing, what the weather was, where the sun was, and I had to really map it all out. And so my starting point was this picture.
And what was it about this picture that was of interest to you?
Well, I was studying Google Earth and Google Street View, trying to understand where this was happening. And then I thought maybe I could get a clue from the background. So I noticed these few buildings, this silo, this telephone pole, this other outbuilding, and I zoomed in on them, and I tried to see if I could locate them using Google Earth or Street View.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 250. Is this a close-up of that background from Exhibit 211 that you just circled?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 251. Is this a...
Could we go back one for
Certainly.
a second? Which would be that one. What was important to me was I was trying to determine an alignment between two different things that were actually physically separated from one another, so I could draw a line between them, you know, looking down in a plan view, we call that, and map out where the car was. So the best thing that I found that I could use was this telephone pole, which is actually quite a bit in the foreground, and the corner of this building. That was what I used.
Is this a map that you prepared?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what it depicts?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, that telephone pole is quite a bit in the foreground. And so here's the telephone pole, and here's the line that connects the telephone pole with the corner of this building, which is that building we talked about previously. That's my alignment line, and I took that and I just extended it out across the road. And so that was my beginning step in trying to determine, you know, what some of these items were. Then I moved on to taking a look at the sun position and the sun angle. You'll see, you could go one or two slides forward for a second. this one. You can use websites online to determine the sun angle and the position in the sky. And it's basically two numbers that you're looking for. One of them is the angle, in which case at 9 a.m. on the date, and you could program in the date that you're looking for, and a location. So you use the actual coordinates of the location and the day, and if you have those two things, then it will tell you the direction of the sun off of due north. So due north is either 0 or 360, and the sun was off at 99 degrees. So basically it was a little bit south of east. It was basically east-southeast. Then the next thing was, how high is it in the sky? So at 8 a.m., the sun is only at about 12.5 degrees above the horizon. So those are my two pieces of information that I then went back and plotted on that previous map. That would be this one. Well, now we know that the sun angle was 99 degrees, so I put the sun here. And the sun was very low in the sky. It was only 12.5 degrees above the horizon. And I happen to know from the pictures there are trees here. And so the question then becomes, was the sun above those trees or below the trees? Because a 12.5 degree angle, it could be either. The other thing was, by looking at the position of the car in the police photos, I placed it in the position that I felt that it was placed when it was back down into the ditch. And that was pretty much northwest, aiming northwest. And I could also tell by the original picture that I discussed earlier that the photographer was about here, because we could see the car. We're kind of clipping the back end of the car in a way, and then we could come and see this whole area. So I was able, with a pretty good degree of confidence, to map out where the car was and what these various angles were doing. Could go forward. And then just a little bit of weather
record,
information.
This is Exhibit 252. And is this a weather report for that day?
Yes. And I've encircled the area that was of interest, 68 degrees, barometric pressure 29.82, 5-mile-an-hour wind out of the east. And after I did all that, it was useful information to me, but it wasn't anything that I felt I needed to do anything further with. I needed to know that. Then you could go on to the next one. We saw that. So then I just went back to the police photos. And an interesting thing happens in the police photos. There are a series of police photos that look like this. Everything's dark. The headlights are bright, and the reflection off of the first responders' high visibility outfits are really, really, really bright. But the car itself is dark, and I would say that the appearance of the windshield, not particularly persuasive, particularly when you have this light shining in your eyes. And this kind of cloud, that doesn't really jump out as being like damage. That could be condensation, that could be the rear view mirror. These areas here are not really visible in this picture. Go ahead.
Did you take into consideration photographs of vehicles that exhibit condensation, for example?
Yes, I did. For my own study, I collected off the internet pictures of cars and also house windows that have various types of condensation on them.
I'm showing you Exhibit 254.
Well, you could see here that not unusual to see car windows fog up. And that fogging can take a variety of different patterns. And depending on, the lighting, it might be very pronounced or it might not be visible at all.
Can I have the next photograph, please? I'll show you Exhibit 255. Is this another example of condensation on a windshield?
Yes, and the condensation is here. Just shows you could get condensation in streaks or irregular patterns, and it's pretty normal to see that type of thing.
I'm going to show you Exhibit 256. Is this another example of condensation on a window?
Yes.
And I'm going to show you Exhibit 257. And what does this demonstrate?
This is just a picture I picked up off the internet that shows what it looks like when you're looking right into the front of a car when it's just early morning. The sun's either just coming up or just going down, but it's not brightly illuminating the car. And you've got headlights in your eyes. What tends to happen is the appearance of the windshield tends to recede. You don't see it that clearly.
Now, is it your suggestion that there was condensation on the Kendhammer vehicle, or is it your suggestion that a passerby might view the windshield and assume that they're seeing condensation?
The latter.
As a result of your investigation into this matter, were you able to reach a conclusion to a reasonable degree of certainty in your profession about what it was that a passerby would see when driving by the Kendhammer vehicle on the morning of September 16, 2016?
Your Honor, I object to speculation and competence to what eyewitnesses
Sustained.
might see.
Show you what's been marked as Exhibit 259. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
What is that?
This is my report dated July 22nd, 2017.
And does that report contain your conclusions and opinions to a reasonable degree of certainty in your profession?
Yes.
And does it set the reasons for having reached those conclusions?
Yes, it does.
Your Honor, I move that exhibit into evidence.
No objection.
259 will be received.
Mr. Meshulam, I've put Exhibit 5 back in front of you. Could you point out with the laser pen once again the area where you found that chip in the,
Oh, the chip?
yes.
The chip is here.
You said something about a chip like that can be caused by a small stone?
Yes. The chip itself could be caused by just a very small, sharp stone, but it would not be accompanied by all of these radial cracks because there would be not enough mass of the small stone to push the glass enough to create that.
And is that what leads you to the conclusion that glass wasn't just chipped beforehand, but instead experienced some form of force or impact?
Yes, I believe the combination of the little tiny chip at the center with the significant extent of spider webbing in all directions tells me that there was just something placed, something pretty hard placed on the glass at that point, which remember is a high point of a curve, and pressed down pretty forcefully enough to cause those cracks to propagate.
And how much, relatively speaking, how much force was necessary to achieve that crack or fracture pattern?
Well, it's a good idea to talk about the difference between impact and force because they're really different. Let's talk about impact for a second. Impact is generally considered to be a lot more than force, because it comes in hard and there's just this sharp moment where something happens. I don't believe that was caused by a pipe impact, for instance. That is not my belief at all because the pipe is pretty heavy thing, over 10 pounds. Someone attempting to put a pipe into the windshield would not be able to achieve that tiny little crack. They would have a lot more damage. Going back to, could you restate the question?
Well, I, you were making a distinction between impact
Oh.
and force.
Right.
And you
Okay.
explained that impact, did you just explain that impact would not create the pattern in what you believe is the third fracture?
Yes. Yes.
And how does impact differ from force?
Because of its sudden, momentary nature, and it's generally considered to be I don't know how to explain it, like more of a violent force, as opposed to pressure, or just simply a force, which can be more uniform and can be spread around and dissipated just by the material receiving the force.
So is it your opinion, to a reasonable degree of certainty in your profession, that the fracture pattern you have continually identified as number 3 was the product of pressure as opposed to impact?
Yes.
I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Michel.
I heard your name a couple different ways. Is it Mr. Meshulam?
That's a good one.
Mr. Meshulam, you read the crime lab reports in this case, is that right?
Yes.
Did you misunderstand parts of the crime lab report? Or do you think you understood all of it?
If you could be more specific, I could probably answer that question.
You have Exhibit 259 in front of you. That's your report.
Yes.
The page 14 of that report. I think it would be the 4th sentence in that text. You indicated that police have theorized that because there is not much glass inside the vehicle, that Mrs. Kendhammer was murdered when the vehicle door was opened. However, this is faulty logic. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you believe that the police theory is that there's not much glass inside the vehicle?
It was my understanding at that point in my reading it that that's what was being said.
Okay. In crime lab report from Mr. Stalkey, Stalkey's report, number 3, number 3. Exhibit number 91, it indicated that glass fragments were present on surfaces in the front seating area, These surfaces include but are not limited to the dash, center console, the floor, and both front seat cushions. Heavier deposits of fractured glass were observed in the front passenger compartment. Glass fragments were more heavily distributed below the flat fractured area of the windshield. No glass fragments were located in the map pocket of the front passenger door. Do you remember reading that report?
Yes.
Ms. Stokey? Where did you get the understanding that the police theory was that there was not much glass in the vehicle then?
Well, when I read the statement when I hear the statement that you just read to me, I don't hear anything that really communicates volume. I hear distribution, where the glass was. I don't hear any measurements stating any particular weight, number of particles, or anything else. I don't remember sitting here this moment where I got the idea that the police did not feel there was much glass in the car. I do remember the mention of the map pocket not having any particles.
Okay. But there was nowhere that indicated the police theorized there was not much glass in the vehicle, correct?
I can't really answer that any more than I already have.
I'm going to ask you a couple questions about the exhibit number 5 that's already up there. And you indicated, if I understand you correctly, that the lines indicated that are going towards what you would call impact area 3 began on the right and then crossed over this line in the middle and then got bigger. Is that accurate?
I didn't see what line in the middle you're referring to.
Well, the line that you were talking about that went through the flap. Yes.
What was the part about getting bigger?
Well, you indicated on the other side of the crack in the middle it was
Here?
smaller.
Here.
Is that accurate?
Yes. Thinner.
Thinner, and it got larger on the other side of that vertical crack. Is that accurate?
Yes.
If I understand you correctly, you believe that the crack in the center of the windshield happened first. Is that right?
You mean number 1?
Yes.
Yes, I believe number 1 happened first.
And is that in part due to the vertical crack that we see going down the windshield?
This one?
Yes.
Yes, in part.
That's why you have that opinion, right?
That's one of the reasons I have that opinion, yes.
If you can go to exhibit 140 for me. If you can turn on the Now, this is exhibit number 140. That would be a picture of the impact area on the left side with the flap still open. Is that accurate? You agree with me on that?
When you say the left side, what do you mean by that?
Compared to the impact area on the right side or the middle of the windshield.
Yeah, I'm just lost by your left and right. We've been using 1, 2, and 3.
Okay.
Would it be okay to continue that?
This shows areas 2 and 3, correct?
Yes, this is number 2, and that's number 3.
And looking at impact area number 3, as you call it, I'm going to use my laser pointer. It appears that there are some lines going to the right, towards the upper right, straight up, the upper left, straight left, left and down and to the right, and then it appears there are a number of lines going down to the right, and then the one you mentioned that goes straight across the hole, and even above that. Would it be almost 360 degrees?
Well, there are cracks definitely in 360 degrees from number 3.
Okay. And the one that you were mentioning is a larger one that my laser pointer is on. It seems to go over where the hole would be, but there are others, are there not, that seem to go and continue on the other side of where the hole is and continue to that large vertical line. Would you agree with me on that?
To the, in this region, which would be below, it appears that this crack may have emanated from number 3.
And then moving a little bit on a clock more towards 4 o'clock and 3 o'clock, do those lines continue?
Well, they may be coming from the prior, there were 2 prior impacts that took place right in that location.
I'm asking you what you observe. They appear to travel right from impact number 3, do they not?
Well, I've got lines that actually are running vertical right here.
My question, sir, does it appear that some lines are going from impact number 3 and going through the hole and continuing on?
It appears that some of them are, but I don't necessarily agree that they are radial cracks off of number 3.
I understand that. The crack that we've been talking about, was it your opinion that after it crossed the vertical crack, it continued on to the area that was later impact number 3?
It may or may not have.
At the time that that crack would have formed from perhaps a punch in area number 1,
There's a-
impact 2 and 3 would not have been there, correct? They would have came after.
Yes, this crack came first, and then this activity took place afterward, but this one occurred first, and then that one occurred after it through the prying action.
And the line that we're talking about would have ended where impact number 3 just happened to happen moments later? Is that your testimony?
I'm not sure that it actually ends up at that spot, because if you look at it, it's potentially a little bit, it potentially may miss it and intersect some other adjacent cracks.
Those cracks wouldn't have been there, though, until the pipe would have been pulled out, correct?
Well, you're looking at a mess of cracks, some of which occurred during the initial pipe impact also, so some of them would have been there.
The impact of the pipe, you indicated that the flap that's created when a cutting surface impacts a windshield, the cut would occur where the pipe first impacts the windshield, and a flap is usually left where the last part of the cutting surface would impact the windshield. Did I have that right?
Yep.
In this photograph, the flap is, if you're going to use a compass, it would be to the northeast. If it were a clock, it'd be to the maybe 2 o'clock position. Do you agree with that?
Yes, in this picture, yes.
And the cutting, where it would have started cutting, would have been the opposite, the southwest or the 7 or 8 o'clock position. Is that accurate?
Probably, yes.
And this photograph is correctly orientated into up, down, left, and right. Do you agree with that?
It's close.
This is exhibit should be 135. Is that 135? Do you agree that the other picture correctly impacted where the flap was, where the vertical line was, compared to where the overall windshield is, up, down, left, right?
Is your question, is the picture oriented
Yes.
correctly? Yes.
And so, probably easier to see back on exhibit 5. Just because it's larger.
Is there glare on that for the jury? Go ahead.
The cutting surface would have started on the lower left. Is that accurate?
Probably, yes. You mean on this picture?
Correct.
Yes.
Well, not on the pictures, but just on the actual windshield.
Well, I've noticed that when you look at pictures of curved objects and then they get flattened out, It looks a little bit different from one picture to the next.
On all the pictures that are oriented with our up, down, left, right the same, did you ever see anything other than what's depicted as the flap being the lower left starting cutting and the upper right would be where it would stop?
No, that's generally how it looks to me, but even these two pictures look a little different,
I understand.
even though I'm saying they're both oriented properly.
I understand.
Yeah.
That would be consistent with somebody standing next to the car and taking a pipe and punching it through the windshield, correct?
What would be consistent?
The cutting surface would be towards them, and the last part to hit would probably be the pipe side away from them, correct?
Well, whoever wanted to do that could angle the pipe whatever direction they wanted.
Would you agree with me it's more likely that a person swinging a pipe at another object, the inside of that pipe would more likely strike the windshield first compared to striking from the other direction?
Objection, speculative competence.
That's a stretch because a person would have the ability to angle the pipe any direction they wanted.
Mr. Meshulam, correct? The exhibit number 5 that shows the difference between impact number 2 and impact number 3, a person drawing a pipe out of that hole, is your position that while they're drawing the pipe out of the hole, they're bending it towards them, correct?
Eventually, yes.
And at some point, the pipe would be almost all the way out of the hole, bent more towards them. And is that when you say the impact might occur at impact number 3?
Yes, and I wouldn't use the term bent because the pipe doesn't bend, but angled toward them, yes.
Angled would be better?
Yes.
I'll say angled. When the pipe is angled towards them, the entire length of the pipe would be resting against the glass, wouldn't it?
No, because the glass is curved
Okay.
and the pipe is straight.
The part closest to the hole would still be in contact with the pipe, correct? Is the pipe still in the hole?
I'm not following the question, sir.
As you draw a pipe out of the hole, the area of the glass closest to the hole would still be in contact with the pipe, correct? The glass would be still touching the pipe, correct?
I'm really not picturing what you're saying. I'm sorry.
Maybe I'm not describing it right, I apologize.
Okay.
But as you draw the pipe out of the hole,
Yes.
on the side of the hole is still in contact with the pipe, correct? Until the pipe's all the way out.
Well, it could be. It could be completely free of any part of the glass until that last 1 or 2 inches where the pipe was angled over and then the one end of it caught this bulge and the other end of it pressed down on number 3.
Well, you know the pipe's 53 inches long.
Yes.
So one end of the pipe is not going to be on one impact point, another end on the other impact point. Isn't that what you just said?
No, what I was trying to say was that when Mr. Kendhammer pulled the pipe out of the hole in the windshield, it was coming out pretty straight. I don't think there was a lot of interference between pipe and hole until that last 1 or 2 inches of pipe travel, wherein he brought the pipe around in his direction to retrieve it, retract it more in his direction, and at that point, 2 contacts took place. One was at the end of the pipe where it hooked underneath a remaining portion of the glass around the hole that I was calling the bulge or the crescent, and then the other point of contact was number 3, which was acting as a fulcrum point for a brief time. If Mr. Kendhammer is way out there at the end of a 53-inch pipe, he would be exerting quite a bit of mechanical advantage, pushing down on number 3. Plenty of, even with a minor downward force on his end, there'd be plenty of force to bring about all that spider webbing at number 3.
Is your position that impact number 3 is the pipe hitting that or pressing down on it as it's angled out?
Pressing down on it like a lever fulcrum.
Okay. So the pipe is 53 inches long. You indicated the pipe would be taken straight out of the hole until the last couple inches were still left inside the windshield, correct?
Yes.
Right. So while he's standing at the passenger side, his arm would be over where that hole is, pulling it out, straight out, correct? Right?
Yes.
The last couple inches left in that hole is when he would angle it towards him, correct?
Yes.
And that little end that's still left in the windshield is caught underneath impact area number 2, right?
Yes.
Wouldn't, because the pipe is straight, the entire length of glass between area number 2 and 3 would have contact with the pipe, correct?
No, not necessarily, because the extreme end of the pipe is rising up because it's taking the glass with it. The PVB is bulging up, and so that end of the glass is rising up. And like I said, the windshield is curved
Yes.
in both directions, horizontally and vertically, and so there will be only one point at which, when the pipe comes down, that straight pipe is going to touch the highest part of the glass curvature, and that's where the contact takes place.
Is the windshield curved from the middle to the sides in a, the highest point would be the middle, lowest point would be the sides of the windshield?
It's curved in two planes, so that means that it's curved, like if you were to slice it horizontally, it would be curved that way. And
Yes.
if you were to slice it vertically, it would be curved that way. And not necessarily a uniform curve either. These are done in molds. So the mold is designed for a particular vehicle, make, and model.
The question is simple. The center of the windshield would be higher than the left or the right, or the top or bottom.
Well, higher means what?
Closer to the person viewing it.
From which side?
The person viewing a windshield, the center of the windshield would be closest to me, the left and right would be further away from me.
Okay, so in other words, if you're standing in front of the vehicle, dead center in front of the vehicle, then the closest part of the windshield to you would be the center bottom.
Okay. Would the center be closer to me than the left and the right?
If you were positioned there, yes.
Okay. The impact area between 2 and 3, which would be closer to me if I'm standing in front of the vehicle? Impact 2?
Between 2 and 3. If you're standing in front of the vehicle, the number 2 would be slightly closer to you than number 3.
Okay. The pipe then being angled upwards towards the passenger side, is it possible for a straight length of pipe to be impacting area 3 and not impacting the glass between areas 2 and 3?
Yes.
How is that possible, given that impact area 2 would be closer to me if I'm standing in front of the vehicle?
Well, the first thing that you said was irrespective of your position. And then you added in the element of where you're standing, so that actually confuses my answer. But if the question is...
Let me start over, Mr. Mitchell.
Okay.
The question is, if a person is taking the pipe out as you described, as Mr. Kendhammer did, the only impact point, in your opinion, is impact area 2 and 3, not in between 2 and 3, and not on the other side of impact area number 3. Just one point of impact.
Except that I have not called number 3 impact. It's really pressure or force.
Area 3.
Okay. Yeah, keep in mind, the area between 2 and 3 is a very small area. It's just a few inches, and it just received a pretty major blow with a pipe, an incoming pipe. So it's, not hard to understand that that glass between 2 and 3 might already be a little bit depressed. It may very well be that the first intact piece of glass that it encountered at the highest point of it would be the place where the pipe would rest as a lever fulcrum.
Your scenario as you describe it is still consistent with a person pushing a pipe through the windshield and then taking it out, bending it towards them. Angling it towards them, I apologize.
I think that could happen.
Which end of the pipe do you believe entered the windshield? The end with the mud and dirt on it, or the end that had the fitting or the coupling on it?
I don't know for sure.
The photo that you showed with yourself leaning towards the impact area number 1, remember that?
Yes.
You were leaning forward in that photograph, correct?
Yes.
You have to lean forward to reach the windshield, right?
Well, I think I could have reached it if I wasn't leaning forward, but I was attempting to show sort of a body in movement, trying to apply a force on the glass. So I was leaning more into it.
You also, the photograph did not show this angle, but you would have to lean to the right a little bit to get your left hand to the center of the windshield.
Yes, true.
You'd also be leaning, placing your hand below right about where the rear view window or rear view mirror would have been. Is that right?
Which hand?
The rear view mirror.
No, you said you're placing your hand, and I said, which hand do you mean?
In the photograph, you're placing your left hand, right?
Right, but you didn't specify in that question which hand you meant. That's what I was trying to clarify.
In the photograph, you place your left hand on the glass, right?
Yes.
And in that photograph, where you placed your left hand would have been right below where the rear view mirror would have been, right?
I think it was below and to the left of the rear view mirror.
By the document camera. This is at 245. Good. Can you see on that photograph, it might be clear in the copy you have, but do you agree with me if you look at a photograph right in there is where the bracket was for the rearview mirror?
Yeah, it's a little hard to see. I'm going to see if I have it in my pictures better.
It was in your report as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Yes,
Okay. You agree?
yes.
Your hand in that photograph appears not to be straight at the wrist, but cocked a little bit upwards. Is that accurate?
Yes,
And you have to do that in order to have both sets of knuckles fit flush against the glass. Is that accurate?
maybe.
Your left hand is reaching across your body, and naturally, if your arm were straight, only the back knuckles would have touched, but if you cock it up a little bit, then all knuckles would hit. Is that-
Sure, but keep in mind when the impact actually took place, this glass was physically moved. So I don't know exactly what Mr. Kendhammer's wrist was doing at that time.
I understand. I'm just asking you about the photograph,
Okay.
your hand.
Yes, my wrist is cocked back a little bit.
And it would take some force to impact that windshield. Would you agree?
Some force means what?
It's more than a tap. It's a large amount of force. How'd you classify it? Could you? Or is
Um,
is it unknown?
Well, it's a sufficient amount of force to break the glass. I don't know how to quantify it.
In your report, did you call it adrenaline-fueled superhuman strength?
Yes,
So adrenaline-fueled superhuman strength is what you thought it would take.
yes,
While we're on that, you also said that he rose to the challenge in a way few people could or would have. Remember saying that?
yes.
That sounds rather subjective, though, doesn't it?
I don't know. Since I've been in the glass business for so long, it's hard to say if that would be subjective or objective.
Well, you said he rose to a challenge in a way few people could or would have, meaning you don't know what other people could or would do in the same situation, right?
Maybe not, but this particular hand impact took quite a bit of eye-hand coordination and strength, and really a quick reaction time. Was that me? Oh, I didn't know I was doing that. I was wondering where the noise was coming from. Excuse me.
Well, you said in a way few people could or would have. Certainly many people would try to protect their loved ones, right?
Definitely.
And do you consider yourself to be an advocate for the defendant?
I don't consider myself an advocate for the defendant,
Okay.
but I believe his.
Well, that's enough.
Okay.
How much are you getting paid for your testimony?
I don't recall. I think for court testimony, I charged $3.50 an hour, I believe, for this case.
And how much do you charge to prepare the report?
I think about $2.40
An hour?
an hour. Yes.
And how many hours did you spend on this report?
I don't recall.
Well, 1 hour, 10 hours?
More than 10 hours for sure. It's quite a few pages.
Do you know how much you've charged the defense at this point?
I don't recall.
You have no idea?
I just don't recall.
No idea. $1,000? $10,000?
I'd prefer not to guess. If you would like, I can research that and send you that information. I'd be happy to.
Well, I think most people would know at this point how much they've already charged somebody. You have no idea.
Well, most people are not me. I don't
I
like
agree
to
with
say
that.
what I don't know and what I don't recall.
Certainly thousands of dollars this is going to be, correct?
It's in the thousands, yes.
And you indicated that you're a full-time expert witness and consultant at this point in your career, correct?
Yes.
What is your salary per year on expert witness fees?
I don't have a salary per year. Oh, I do have a salary per year because of the structure of the corporation. It's in the $60,000 or $70,000 range. But since I'm the owner of the corporation, that means I also, and I'm the sole owner, that means I also would receive the profits from the corporation.
And you have a website to promote yourself as an expert witness, correct?
Yes,
So it's important for you to do a good job for your clients, right?
yes,
And that's how you get more work, right? You don't want to do a bad job.
that's true. I always want to do a good job for my clients.
Now, you were asked some questions about testimony about somebody seeing the windshield as they drove by. Do you remember that?
Yes,
You weren't here to see Mr. Erler's testimony, though, were you?
Correct.
What information did you have other than a police report summarizing his testimony or his statement?
That's what I had.
And you found in looking through the photographs that some photographs looked darker.
We know, I already mapped out where the sun was, and it could have very easily been right at the treetops. So yes, there could have been a very big difference from one, let's say, minute to the next.
Well, Mr. Meshulam, this appears to be seconds, not minute. Is it really your opinion that the sky got that much lighter in a couple seconds?
What tells you that it's seconds?
The people are in almost exactly the same position in each photograph. The first responder, the person doing CPR, the person holding the bag, everything.
That's not a persuasive argument to me, because these are first responders who were doing the same thing for a number of minutes. Is there a timestamp on the photos we could look at?
Mr. Meshulam, did you see the squad video in the case?
I'm sorry?
Did you see the squad video in this case from West Salem Officer Levelholtz?
I didn't hear you. I don't understand what you're saying.
Did you see the squad video in this case from West Salem Officer Levelholtz?
I'm not sure.
Is it important for you to see everything in a case? You testified to that.
Yes.
Did you see the squad video or not?
I've seen lots and lots of things. I'm not 100% sure what you're referring to.
Okay. This was 8 o'clock in the morning, approximately, in September. You agree with that?
Yes.
You believe that the sky will be that dark as Exhibit 147, that's your testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree with me that in Exhibit 147, a number of things look as if they're reflecting light? Do you agree with me on that?
Yes.
And the jackets or the vests of the first responders are reflecting, right?
Yes.
And there's an object in the lower that looks almost like to be a flashlight or a light of some kind. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, Exhibit 148, can you see what that object might be?
No.
Copy of all the photographs, the one that showed, if you just bring up the screen too, the photographic reference of the headlights. That was the one you just showed us, wasn't it? No. One more. In front of you. There it is.
This was Exhibit 209. This was what you used in your report to indicate the headlights would have been shining in somebody's eyes. Do you remember
Yes.
that? But you'd agree with me that given the photos we just saw, it could easily be the camera or the flash of the camera making those headlights look different than what they really were.
I don't understand how a flash would make headlights look different.
Well, you saw the other photograph that made it look like there was something shining that with the human eye really wasn't.
Right, but you're assuming that was from a flash?
I don't know what it was from, but it wasn't shining, right?
You lost me there. I thought what we were talking about was the reflectors on the first responders' outfits were shining. Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
And it sounded like you were saying you were assuming that was due to the flash from the camera?
These aren't trick questions. Let me just ask you
I'm
this.
just trying to understand what you're saying.
I'm not sure you are. In this photograph, do you think that's how a human eye would see a headlight?
Similar, yes.
You think that when a human eye looks at a headlight in daylight hours at 8 a.m., they see a burst around it, hiding some of the car?
It really depends on the outside conditions. These conditions look pretty dark. And if a person's eye is not acclimated to having a bright light shining in it, it could look like that. They could be blinded entirely.
Blinded entirely by headlight.
Sure. If you're coming down a dark street, your eyes are acclimated to dark, and then you're suddenly looking right inside the beam of a headlight, which now is aiming up because the car is backed into a ditch. Yeah, it could be blinding for a second.
And did you visit the scene
Yes,
where this car was?
yes.
Did you take photographs of the tree line at all?
I think so.
Did you provide those to anybody?
I don't recall if they were requested or if I provided them.
Well, you said in your report that if the sun peeked over the trees, it could have been in somebody's eyes. Remember that?
Could you locate that?
You said on page 53, the sun was low behind trees in the distance.
Yes.
If it peeked over the trees, the sunlight light would also be shining in the eyes of someone driving by.
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
But you didn't take a picture of the tree line to see how high that would be compared to the sunlight. Or you did provide pictures of that.
Well, there are police photos that show the tree line. They already exist.
My question was, did you provide photos?
I didn't provide them in the report, but I may have them in my file. What I was looking at more objectively was the sun angle at that time.
The sun angle, whatever it was, would be hidden by clouds, correct?
I don't know that.
Do clouds cover the sun?
Sometimes they do, of course.
If it's overcast and raining, do the clouds cover the sun?
They may cover your direct vision of the sun, but they don't necessarily cover all the light that comes from the sun.
When it's cloudy and raining out, is it less likely a sun will be shining in somebody's eyes?
If they're looking at the same sun and it's sunny, or if it's cloudy and rainy, yes. If you're comparing apples to apples is what I'm trying to say.
What I'm asking
Yeah.
is you understand that day it was raining, correct?
Yes.
And you understand it was overcast, right?
Well, overcast doesn't necessarily mean every single inch of the sky is covered with clouds. So yes, it's overcast.
There's no evidence that the sun was in Mr. Erler's eyes, correct?
I haven't heard anything
That would be the equivalent
from
of-
him.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't hear anything from his report that he said the sun was in his eyes.
If the sun is in somebody's eyes, they usually know it, don't they?
Well, we go through our whole lives. I'm not sure every time the sun's in our eyes, we stop and think the sun is in our eyes. It's sometimes a part of life.
Mr. Erler never testified that he saw any damage to the windshield. He never testified that it could be condensation or something else. If you could see clearly through the windshield and see no people in the car, the fact that there might have been condensation doesn't really matter, does it?
I'm not following your question.
Mr. Erler said he saw no damage to the windshield. Okay? He said he could see through the windshield and see there was no people in the car. Okay? Why do you have an opinion that condensation could have been in place and he would have mistaken that for damage?
I don't think that's what I said.
Well, your testimony is that he could have seen condensation and mistake it for damage, or seen damage and mistake it for condensation. Is that right?
The second, the latter.
But he said he saw neither and could see it through the windshield. Okay? Isn't it speculative to assume he might have seen something else that wasn't there?
And what do you say that I'm saying that he saw that wasn't there?
Condensation.
I didn't say that he saw condensation. I said that you can easily, the human eye is used to seeing condensation on windows and windshields as a very familiar look. It comes in all different sizes and shapes, and it would be very easy, given those circumstances, to mistake some irregularities in the windshield surface with the appearance of condensation.
That assumes he saw an irregularity, though, right?
I didn't assume. I said if he saw an irregularity, it would be easy to think that it was something else.
And the if is what makes it speculation, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
The if is what makes it speculation, right?
No, it makes it conditional.
And conditional means you have to assume a fact first, that he saw some damage.
Correct. That's correct. I agree.
Thank you.
Hurley?
I put exhibit 148 up on the screen. Mr. Meshulam, you recognize this scene?
Yes.
And you've examined that automobile?
Yes, I have.
And you examined that windshield?
Yes.
And did you previously demonstrate to the jury the approximate point from which this photograph was taken?
Yes.
And how easy is it to see the damage to the windshield in this photograph?
Not at all.
You were asked some questions about your compensation in this matter. When you were retained in this matter, were you given any instruction about what the outcome of your examination should be?
No.
You were asked questions about your hourly rate. And could you tell me again what your hourly rate was for all of the preparation and examination leading up to the report, and then your hourly rate for testifying at trial?
I don't remember 100%, but I think I'm charging $240 an hour for all events other than testimony, which would be either $340 or $350 an hour.
Now, when you charge that hourly rate, does it take into consideration your overhead?
Yes, of course.
That is your physical place of business, for
Yes.
example? Does the state provide you with desk and administrative services as it might, for example, a sheriff's deputy or someone who works at the crime laboratory?
No, I pay for everything.
Does the state provide you with a crime laboratory?
No.
To the extent that you must do laboratory work or engage in examination or calculation, is that something for which you must pay out of your own pocket?
If there are out-of-pocket costs, I usually will get reimbursed, but the time involved would be all my time.
And does the state provide you, for example, with a pension or holidays?
No, of course not.
Is that something which you have to pay for yourself?
Yes,
And does that factor into your hourly rate?
yes, of course.
To the extent you need the services of a secretary or an assistant, does the state provide you with that?
No,
Is that something you have to pay for out of your own pocket?
yes,
And is that something that is factored into your hourly rate?
yes.
Does the state provide you with compensation for sick days as it does its employees?
I wish, but no.
So to the extent that you lose time that you could otherwise spend on items, is that something that you factor into your hourly rate?
Yes, of course.
Is your hourly rate such that it's an incentive for you to lose your objectivity?
No, definitely not.
You were asked about whether pleasing your client would enhance your reputation. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
Would being unobjective enhance or detract from your reputation?
That would hurt me terribly. I can't afford to do that.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Great, anything else?
No.
This time, does any juror have a question of Mr. Meshulam? 4, 5, 6? Well, we're going to have to share clipboards or take some sheets off. Mr. Meshulam, there's several questions. Jurors should not take account if I didn't ask any particular question or questions. First one marked 515. In your opinion, was impact number 1 made by 1 or 2 fists? That's one by the rear view mirror.
1 fist.
516. Can you tell by the pattern the amount of force or speed of a 10-plus pound object that could create the cracks in the windshield?
Can I tell by the what? By the pattern?
Well, they're asking about the cracks themselves in the windshield. Does that have anything to do with the pattern based on the amount of force and speed that a 10-pound object would cause those from?
Yes, but I'm not sure if I have that fine of a adjustment in this case. Generally speaking, though, if the projectile is going faster and if it has a nice clean shot through the glass, there will be less collateral damage around it, and slower, there will be more. In this case, it's kind of middle amount. So that's, all I really have to say. If I were to put a number on it, anywhere from maybe 30 to 45 miles an hour.
Okay, Exhibit 520 states, when was your 2017 fractology seminar in conjunction with your inspection of the vehicle in this case?
Good question.
I think that was in June of this year. Does that sound right?
My inspection was June.
I think.
Yes, yeah, it was. And I apologize. Fractography course was June 12th through 16th. Does that make sense? And the inspection was June 27th. So it was immediately, the course was immediately before the inspection.
The next question under that exhibit number is, how many of your 30 cases related to windshields versus buildings that you testified about?
I have just a handful of windshield cases. I have a few other cases that involve bodily injury and laminated glass specifically, and testing it in a laboratory. And those cases tend to be window cases, building window cases.
And of the 30 cases, how many involved a fist fracturing glass?
This is the first.
Was there any outward bulge in area 3 to reinforce the pulling out of the pipe?
Area 3 was the small one to the upper left. There was no bulge in either direction. It was the original windshield curvature.
Those are the only questions I'll ask. Anything else, Mr. Grinke? Well, I guess Mr. Hurley.
if Area 3 was used as a fulcrum point, is the lack of any bulge in either direction consistent with the use of that area as a fulcrum point?
Yes, the outward bulge of the glass gives it a little bit of extra strength in that direction. And it's kind of like a keystone arch in a building, where when you have all the things creating an arch, they're actually stronger against pressure coming from above. So it was, the force was enough to cause that spider web, radial cracking in the glass, but it wasn't sufficient to push the glass down.
I have no other question.
Mr. Grinke?
None.
Now, this looks like a good time for lunch, so we'll break for lunch. We'll be out about an hour. We'll try to start back up at 1. When you're out, don't talk about the case. Talk about anything else you wish, but not the case.
These? Well, that's all I had, because this is my book. I don't have anything else. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Thank you. Court reporter.
Record can show we're outside the presence of the jury. Anything either side wishes to put on before we adjourn? Mr. Grinke?
Okay.
Mr. Hurley? Okay. All right, be in recess till about 1.